An old man sat alone in a house that used to be full of noise. The alarm clock that once dragged him out of bed at 5 in the morning now sat silent on the nightstand, unplugged, gathering dust. The badge that once hung around his neck, the one that let him into a building where people needed him, respected him, depended on him, now sat in a drawer he hadn't opened in months. He had spent 43 years building a career, raising a family, paying a mortgage, showing up, and now at 68, with nothing left to prove and nowhere he had to be, he felt something he never expected to feel: empty, not tired, not relieved, empty. He had planned for this moment his entire life. He had saved for it, dreamed about it, counted down to it. And when it finally arrived, it felt less like freedom and more like falling. If that story makes you uncomfortable, good, because it should. Because somewhere out there right now, that story is being lived by millions of people who did everything right, who worked hard, who sacrificed, who followed the rules, and still found themselves staring at an empty calendar, wondering who they even are without a job title attached to their name. But here's what almost nobody tells you: retirement is not a reward you receive. It is a test you must pass. And 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers already wrote the answer key. Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because I am going to show you 10 Stoic lessons that will not just help you survive retirement, they will help you turn it into the richest, most meaningful chapter of your entire life. Welcome to Wisdom of the Stoics. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for anyone who refuses to drift through life on autopilot. If you are new here, this channel exists for one simple reason: to take the timeless wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus and translate it into something you can actually use today, in your career, your relationships, and yes, in the years after you finally hang up your work boots for good. Before we go further, if the story you just heard hit close to home, do me one favor. Type the word present in the comments below. I want to know how many of you are watching this, because retirement is closer than you think, whether that's 5 years away or 5 months away. And if you find value in what follows, consider subscribing. This channel is built by people just like you, people who want more out of the second half of life than a rocking chair and reruns. Now let's get into it. The retirement myth nobody talks about. For most of human history, retirement didn't exist. You worked until your body gave out, or you died. The modern idea of retirement, decades of leisure, funded by savings, is barely a century old. And yet we've built an entire culture around chasing it like it's the finish line of life. Here is the problem with treating retirement like a finish line. Finish lines are where things end. And if your entire identity, your sense of purpose, your daily structure, and your feeling of being needed were all built around your career, then crossing that finish line doesn't feel like victory. It feels like disappearance. Psychologists have a name for what happens to many retirees within the first year: the retirement dip. A sudden spike in depression, a loss of physical health, a breakdown in marriages that had quietly depended on both partners being out of the house 9 hours a day. Studies following retirees have found measurable declines in both mental and physical well-being in the months immediately following retirement. Not because retirement itself is bad, but because most people retire from something without ever building a plan for what they are retiring to. This is where the Stoics become essential, because the Stoics were never obsessed with career, status, or income. They were obsessed with something deeper: how to live a life of virtue, purpose, and tranquility regardless of your circumstances. Whether you were an emperor like Marcus Aurelius or a former slave like Epictetus, the philosophy applied the same, which means it applies just as powerfully to a retiree in their 60s, 70s, or 80s as it did to a Roman soldier or senator 2,000 years ago. So let's walk through the 10 lessons, one at a time. Grab a coffee, get comfortable, because by the end of this video, you will see retirement not as an ending, but as the beginning of the most intentional years of your life. Lesson 1. Retire from your job, not from your purpose. The first and most important shift the Stoics offer is this: you can retire from a job. You can never retire from purpose. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, wrote a private journal to himself that we now call Meditations. In it he reminds himself again and again that a human being exists to work, not for wages, but because working towards something meaningful is what a rational, social creature is built for. He compares it to the way a bee exists to make honey or a vine exists to bear grapes. A human being who does nothing, who contributes nothing, who exists only for comfort, is failing at the basic function of being human. Notice what he is not saying. He is not saying you need a paycheck. He is not saying you need a boss, a commute, or a performance review. He is saying that a life without contribution, without a reason to get up in the morning that serves something beyond yourself, is a life adrift. Here's a story that illustrates this perfectly. A woman named Diane retired from 31 years as a hospital nurse. For 3 decades, her identity was wrapped entirely around being needed. Patients needed her. Doctors relied on her. Her schedule mattered to dozens of people every single day. On her last day of work, her co-workers threw her a party, gave her a card signed by the whole floor, and sent her home to finally relax. 6 weeks later, Diane's daughter found her sitting in her car in the driveway, engine off, just staring at the garage door. She hadn't gone inside in 20 minutes. When her daughter asked what was wrong, Diane said something that should stop all of us in our tracks. "I don't know what I'm for anymore." That sentence, "I don't know what I'm for anymore," is the retirement crisis in 7 words. The Stoic answer isn't to go back to nursing. It's to identify the function nursing served in Diane's life, being needed, contributing skill toward relieving suffering, being part of something larger than herself, and find a new expression of that same function. Diane, 6 months later, began volunteering twice a week, teaching basic first aid and health literacy classes at a community center. No paycheck, no badge, but the exact same purpose repackaged. This is the first Stoic lesson for retirement. Don't ask, "What will I do with my time?" Ask, "What was my job actually for underneath the paycheck?" Then go find a new way to serve that same purpose. That is how you retire from a job without retiring from a life. If this idea is landing with you, drop a comment telling me what your job was actually for underneath the paycheck. I read every single comment, and I promise you, seeing your answers helps other people in the comments figure out their own. Lesson 2. Master the dichotomy of control. If you've watched this channel before, you've heard us talk about the dichotomy of control, because it might be the single most useful idea in all of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus, who spent years as a slave before becoming one of history's great philosophers, opened his most famous work with this exact principle: some things are up to us, and some things are not. Our judgments, our choices, our effort, our attitude, these are up to us. Our health, our wealth, our reputation, what other people think of us, how long we live, these are not up to us. Suffering, Epictetus argued, comes from confusing the two categories, from trying to control what we can't and neglecting what we can. Retirement is a minefield of this confusion. You cannot control whether your knees hold up for another decade of hiking. You cannot control whether your pension fund performs the way you hoped. You cannot control whether your kids call every week or once a month. You cannot control whether your spouse wants to travel and you want to stay home, or the reverse. But you absolutely control how you respond to all of it. You control whether you spend your morning worrying about a market downturn you cannot influence, or whether you spend that same morning on a walk, a phone call to an old friend, or 10 pages of a book you've been meaning to read. You control whether you let a health diagnosis define the rest of your life, or whether you decide, like the Stoics did, that the mind can remain free even when the body is not. Consider the story of a retired engineer named Robert, who spent the first 2 years of retirement checking his investment portfolio 3 or 4 times a day. Every dip sent his blood pressure through the roof. Every rally gave him a temporary high that vanished by the next correction. He was retired, technically, but he had simply traded a boss for a stock ticker. He had handed his peace of mind over to something entirely outside his control. It took a health scare, a minor heart episode his doctor called a wake-up call for Robert to finally apply the dichotomy of control. He didn't stop caring about his finances. He simply stopped obsessing over the part he couldn't control and redirected that same energy toward what he could: his spending habits, his daily walk, his diet, his time with his grandchildren. Within a year, his blood pressure was down, and so, he said, was his blood pressure about his blood pressure. The lesson here is simple but demanding. Every single day in retirement, ask yourself, is this within my control? If it is, act. If it isn't, release it. That single habit, practiced daily, will save you more suffering than any financial advisor, doctor, or therapist ever could. Lesson 3. Memento mori. Let death sharpen your days, not frighten them. Now we arrive at a concept that sounds heavy, but is actually one of the most liberating ideas the Stoics ever developed. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. This is not morbid. This is the opposite of morbid. The Stoics used the constant awareness of death not to create fear, but to create urgency and gratitude. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he could leave this life at any moment, and he used that fact to shape every single decision he made. Because knowing your time is limited is the fastest way to stop wasting it. Here is why this matters so much in retirement specifically. Retirement is often the first stretch of life where death stops being an abstract, distant idea and starts becoming a felt reality. Friends start passing away. Spouses fall ill. Your own body starts sending signals it never used to send. Many retirees respond to this by shutting down, by avoiding the topic entirely, distracting themselves with television, or worse, becoming paralyzed by anxiety about how much time is left. The Stoic response is radically different. Seneca wrote one of the most powerful essays in all of ancient philosophy called On the Shortness of Life, and in it he makes an argument that should be tattooed on the inside of every retiree's eyelids. It is not that we have a short life, it is that we waste so much of it. Most people, Seneca said, don't begin truly living until it's almost time to stop. They spend their whole lives preparing to live, and then life is over before the living ever starts. Retirement is your chance to correct that. You finally have the time that Seneca said most people waste chasing money, status, and other people's approval. The question Memento mori forces you to ask isn't, how do I avoid thinking about death? It's, given that my days are numbered, and I don't know the number, what do I actually want to fill them with? There's a story about a retired school teacher named Harold who, after losing his wife of 40 years, fell into a depression so deep his children feared for him. A friend gave him a single piece of advice. Write down, right now, 5 things you would regret not doing if you died 1 year from today. Harold wrote, see the ocean one more time, teach his granddaughter to read, reconcile with his estranged brother, learn to paint, and tell his late wife's sister how much she meant to their family. Within 18 months, Harold had done all 5. He said later that Memento mori didn't make him sad about dying. It made him present about living. That is the gift hidden inside this seemingly dark idea. Death, faced honestly, becomes the greatest motivator for meaning that exists. I want you to try this yourself this week. Write down 3 things you would regret not doing. Then tell me one of them in the comments. Not for likes, not for anyone else. Just so that saying it out loud, even to strangers on the internet, makes it a little more real and a little harder to keep postponing. Lesson 4. Amor fati. Love the life you actually have. There is a phrase in Stoic philosophy, later popularized by Nietzsche but rooted deeply in Stoic thought, called Amor fati, the love of fate. It means not merely accepting what happens to you, but actively loving it. Embracing your circumstances, your history, even your hardships, as necessary parts of the life that made you who you are. This is one of the hardest lessons for retirees, because retirement rarely looks like the brochure. Maybe you planned to retire at 60 and had to work until 68. because the market crashed at the wrong time. Maybe you dreamed of traveling the world with your spouse, and now you're navigating retirement alone. Maybe your body doesn't allow for the golf, the hiking, or the grandchildren chasing you imagined. Amor fati doesn't ask you to pretend disappointment doesn't exist. It asks you to stop fighting reality and start working with it. Epictetus put it directly. Don't seek to have events happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. Think about a woman named Carol, who had spent decades imagining retirement as endless travel with her husband Frank. 2 years before Frank's planned retirement, he passed away suddenly from a stroke. Carol's entire vision for this chapter of her life collapsed overnight. For a long time she was angry at fate, angry at the unfairness, angry that the retirement she had earned had been stolen from her. What changed things wasn't forgetting Frank or pretending the loss didn't matter. It was a slow, deliberate shift toward amor fati. Carol began to ask a different question. Not, why did this happen to me? But, given that this is my life now, what can I build from here? She eventually took the trip she and Frank had planned to Portugal, alone. She said it was the hardest and most healing thing she had ever done. She didn't love that Frank was gone. She learned to love the life she actually had, rather than mourning forever the one she had planned. This is amor fati in action, not toxic positivity, not denial, but a fierce, active embrace of your actual circumstances as the raw material for a meaningful life. Whatever your retirement looks like, solo or partnered, wealthy or modest, healthy or managing illness, the Stoic challenge is the same. Stop comparing it to the fantasy and start building with what's real. Lesson 5. Guard your inner citadel from other people's opinions. The Stoics spoke often of the inner citadel, an inner fortress of judgment and character that no external force can break into unless you let it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that people would criticize him, misunderstand him, and judge him no matter what he did, and that none of it could touch his inner peace unless he handed over the keys. This becomes strangely relevant in retirement, in ways people rarely expect. Retirees often face a quiet but persistent form of judgment. Relatives who think you should be doing more, friends who measure their retirement against yours. A culture that constantly implies that if you're not busy, you're being lazy or wasting your life. There's a retired businessman named Gerald who spent his first year of retirement fielding a constant stream of commentary. His brother-in-law kept asking when he was going to find something to do. His old colleagues joked that he must be bored out of his mind. Even strangers at parties, on learning he was retired, would ask, with a slight edge, "So what do you do all day?" As if leisure itself required a defense. Gerald internalized all of it. He started overscheduling himself with commitments he didn't actually want, just to have an answer ready for the next person who asked. He was, in effect, still performing for an audience, except now the performance was retirement itself. The Stoic remedy is to recognize that other people's opinions about how you should spend your time are not facts. They are simply other people's preferences, dressed up as judgments. You do not owe anyone a justification for how you live your retirement. Marcus Aurelius wrote that it takes so little to make a happy life. It is all within your own thoughts, in the way you think about things. If your days are spent on things you find meaningful, whether that's reading, gardening, resting, or simply being present with your grandchildren, that is a legitimate life. Full stop. Guarding your inner citadel means building a quiet, unshakable confidence that your retirement does not need external approval to be valid. Let people wonder. Let people judge. Your peace does not depend on their permission. If you've ever felt that pressure, the "what do you do all day" question, asked with just a hint of judgment, I want you to know you are far from alone. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced this, because I promise you, half the people reading this thread will recognize exactly what you mean. Lesson 6, Premeditatio malorum. Prepare for hardship before it arrives. One of the more unusual Stoic practices is called Premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This means deliberately imagining setbacks and hardships before they happen, not to create anxiety, but to rob future difficulties of their power to shock and destabilize you. Seneca practiced this constantly. Before a big trip, he would mentally rehearse storms, delays, and disasters. Before a difficult meeting, he would imagine the worst version of how it could go. The goal wasn't pessimism, it was psychological preparation. When you have already mentally rehearsed a hardship, its arrival feels less like a catastrophe and more like something you expected and are ready to handle. Retirement is full of predictable hardships that most people refuse to think about until they're already drowning in them. Health decline, the death of friends and spouses, potential financial shocks, loneliness, and the loss of daily structure. Avoiding these thoughts doesn't protect you from them. It just ensures you'll be blindsided when they arrive. Consider a retired couple, Ellen and Tom, who took a very different approach. In their early retirement years, they had an honest, sometimes uncomfortable, conversation about what would happen if one of them became seriously ill or passed away first. They didn't dwell on it obsessively, but they faced it directly, updating their wills, discussing their wishes, talking about how the surviving spouse would rebuild a support system and daily routine. It was hard. It was also, they both said later, one of the most bonding conversations of their marriage. 3 years later, Tom was diagnosed with a serious illness. Because they had already done the difficult mental work of Premeditatio malorum, the diagnosis, while devastating, didn't destroy them. They had already built the emotional and practical scaffolding to face it. Ellen said that facing the what-if years earlier meant that when the what-is arrived, she wasn't starting from zero. This is the value of premeditating hardship. Not to live in fear, but to face reality honestly enough that when difficulty arrives, and in a long retirement, some difficulty always arrives, you meet it as someone who has already thought it through, rather than someone caught completely off guard. Lesson 7. Simplicity is not deprivation, it's freedom. The Stoics were famously skeptical of luxury, not because they hated comfort, but because they recognized that the more your happiness depends on external possessions, the more fragile that happiness becomes. Seneca, despite being one of the wealthiest men in Rome, regularly practiced periods of deliberate simplicity, eating plain food, wearing simple clothes, sleeping on hard surfaces, specifically so that if he ever lost his wealth, he would already know he could survive without it. Retirement, especially in a culture obsessed with retirement as a shopping catalogue of cruises, luxury cars, and constant travel, often becomes a trap of trying to fill an inner emptiness without a spending. The message everywhere is that a successful retirement looks like non-stop consumption of experiences and things. But here's what the Stoics understood 2,000 years before. Modern psychology caught up. The treadmill of consumption never actually satisfies. Whatever level of luxury you achieve becomes the new baseline, and the craving for more simply resets. A retiree chasing happiness through spending is running on the exact same hedonic treadmill. As someone chasing happiness through career promotions, the finish line keeps moving. There's a retired couple, Marge and Bill, who initially spent their first retirement year on an aggressive travel schedule, a cruise, then Europe, then a safari, one expensive trip after another. They came back from each trip more exhausted than fulfilled. It was only when they slowed down, choosing one modest, meaningful trip a year, and filling the rest of their time with simple, low-cost pleasures like cooking together, tending a garden, and weekly dinners with old friends, that they both independently said they felt, for the first time in years, actually content. The Stoic lesson isn't that you should never enjoy nice things in retirement. It's that your contentment should not be dependent on them. Practice enjoying simple pleasures deliberately. A walk, a home-cooked meal, a conversation with an old friend, and you build a kind of resilience that no market crash, downsized pension or cancelled vacation can take away from you. Lesson 8. Cultivate deep relationships, not just busy schedules. The Stoics placed enormous value on friendship and human connection, viewing us as fundamentally social creatures, whose flourishing depends on our bonds with others. Marcus Aurelius wrote about our duty to our fellow human beings constantly, the idea that we are made for cooperation, not isolation. One of the most damaging retirement myths is that filling your calendar with activities equals a fulfilling life. Golf 3 times a week, a full slate of hobbies, constant errands. None of it substitutes for genuine, deep human connection. Research on aging and well-being consistently points to the same conclusion. The quality of your close relationships is one of the strongest predictors of happiness and even longevity in later life, often stronger than wealth, health status, or how busy your schedule is. Consider a retired accountant named Frank, who filled his early retirement with an impressive list of hobbies: woodworking, fishing, a men's group at his church, volunteer work at the food bank. On paper, his life looked full, but Frank confided to his daughter that despite all this activity, he felt strangely lonely. When she asked him who he talked to about things that actually mattered, his fears, his regrets, his hopes for his grandchildren, Frank realized he couldn't think of anyone. He had activity. He didn't have intimacy. The Stoic prescription here is deliberate. Retirement should be used not just to fill time, but to deepen the handful of relationships that matter most. That might mean finally having the honest conversation with an estranged sibling. It might mean scheduling a weekly call with an old friend instead of just a yearly holiday card. It might mean being genuinely present with your spouse instead of simply occupying the same house. Frank eventually started a standing Thursday lunch with 2 old friends from his working years. No agenda, no activity, just conversation. He said that 1 lunch a week gave him more genuine connection than every hobby on his calendar combined. This is the Stoic reminder. Don't confuse a busy schedule with a rich life. Depth beats breadth every single time. Tell me in the comments, who is the one person you've been meaning to reconnect with, but keep putting off? Sometimes just typing it out is the push you need to finally make that call. Lesson 9. Practice the discipline of ascent. Choose your story. Epictetus taught that it's not events themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we form about those events. This is often called the discipline of ascent, the practice of pausing before you automatically accept a negative interpretation of what's happening to you, and instead choosing a more accurate, more empowering interpretation. This becomes enormously powerful in retirement, because retirement is a season of life packed with events that can be interpreted in wildly different ways. Waking up with nothing. Scheduled can be interpreted as I am useless and have nothing to offer, or as I have total freedom to choose what matters today. A health limitation can be interpreted as my best years are over, or as I need to find new ways to engage with life within my current capacity. Watching your children live busy lives without you can be interpreted as I've been forgotten, or as I raised children capable of building full lives of their own. None of these situations change. What changes is the story you assent to. There's a retired professor named Diane, no relation to the earlier nurse, who faced significant hearing loss in her early 70s. Her first instinct was despair. This is the end of meaningful conversation, the end of enjoying music, the end of feeling connected to people. That story, left unchallenged, would have led her into isolation. Instead, with the help of her daughter, who happened to study Stoic philosophy, Diane practiced the discipline of ascent. She examined the automatic judgment. My hearing loss means my social life is over, and asked whether that judgment was actually true, or simply the most catastrophic available interpretation. She got hearing aids. She learned to ask people to face her when speaking. She joined a smaller book club instead of a large, noisy one. The event, hearing loss, didn't change. But the story she told herself about what it meant changed everything, about how she lived with it. This is perhaps the most practically powerful Stoic tool of all. before you accept the first negative story your mind offers about any circumstance in retirement. Pause and ask, is this the only way to interpret this? Almost always it isn't. Lesson 10. Leave a legacy of virtue, not just assets. Finally, we arrive at what may be the deepest Stoic lesson of all. Much of modern retirement planning focuses obsessively on financial legacy, estate planning, inheritance, making sure the money is properly distributed. All of that has its place, but the Stoics would ask a more important question. What kind of person are you leaving behind in the memories of those who knew you? Marcus Aurelius wrote his private journal not for an audience, not for fame, but as a tool to keep becoming a better version of himself until his very last day. He never stopped working on his character even as emperor, even in old age. The Stoic view of legacy isn't about the size of your estate. It's about the quality of your character, passed on through example, through the way you treated people, through the wisdom you shared, through the virtue you modeled. There's a story about a retired factory foreman named Walt, a man of modest means who never accumulated significant wealth. When Walt passed away at 84, his funeral was standing room only, not because he was famous or rich, but because of the sheer number of people whose lives he had touched. Former employees he had mentored decades earlier, neighbors he had helped without ever being asked, grandchildren who spoke not about what he gave them financially, but about the patience, humor, and steadiness he modeled every single day they spent with him. Walt's actual financial legacy was modest. His legacy of character was enormous. And this is the final Stoic lesson for retirement. Your remaining years are not just time to be filled. They are your final, most powerful opportunity to model the kind of character you want remembered. Every conversation with a grandchild, every act of patience with a spouse, every moment of resilience in the face of hardship is a brick in the legacy you are actually building, one far more durable than any inheritance. So ask yourself, honestly, if your retirement years are the closing chapters of your story, what do you want the people who love you to say about who you were? Not just what you left them? Bringing it all together. Bringing it all together. Let's step back for a moment and look at what we've covered. Retiring from your job but never from purpose. Mastering the dichotomy of control instead of stressing over what you cannot change. Using Memento mori to sharpen your days instead of fearing them. Practicing Amor fati to love the actual life you have, not the one you imagined. Guarding your inner citadel from the judgment of others. Preparing honestly for hardship through Premeditatio malorum. Choosing simplicity over the empty treadmill of consumption. Cultivating deep relationships instead of a busy but hollow schedule. Practicing the discipline of ascent to choose empowering interpretations of your circumstances. And finally, building a legacy of character, not just assets. None of these 10 lessons require you to be wealthy. None of them require perfect health. None of them require a specific family situation, a certain amount of savings, or a particular set of hobbies. That is the entire point of Stoic philosophy. It was built to work in any circumstance, for any person at any stage of life, because it deals with the one thing that is always, unconditionally within your control, how you choose to think and how you choose to act. Retirement is not the end of your story. It is the final act, and in a well-told story, the final act is often the most powerful one. The Stoics would tell you that the years ahead are not leftover time to be endured until the end arrives. They are, in fact, the culmination of everything you've learned. The space where all the wisdom life has given you finally gets the room to be lived out fully, deliberately, and on your own terms. The old man in the story we opened with, the one sitting in his empty house, unsure of who he was without his job, his story doesn't have to end in emptiness. It can be rewritten at any point, the moment he decides to apply even one of these 10 lessons. And so can yours. Before you go, if even one of these 10 lessons struck a nerve today, do 3 things for me. First, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it's the single biggest signal that tells YouTube to show this video to someone else out there who might desperately need to hear it today. Second, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics if you haven't already, because we release videos exactly like this one, built to help you navigate every stage of life with the clarity the ancient Stoics offer. And third, and this one matters most, tell me in the comments which of these 10 lessons you most need to apply right now. Not the one that sounds nicest, the one you actually need. Because philosophy that stays in a video is just entertainment. Philosophy that gets applied is what actually changes a life. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Go apply what you've learned, and I will see you in the next one.